Somehow, someway, the 2015 college football season is now nearly a decade old. I cannot believe I'm saying that, and to be honest, college football was a lot different back in 2015. I'm going to try to do a lot of videos this upcoming year, going back in time a decade and talking about what college football was like. And the first video I want to do in this series is taking a look at who were the coaches in the SEC a decade ago. That's exactly what we're going to do in today's video, as we're to talk about who the head coaches were for each and every SEC program, what their reputation going into the 2015 season was looking like, and then a quick blip on how they ended up doing. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about who each and every SEC head coach was back in 2015. Okay, so the first team we're going to talk about is the Tennessee Volunteers, and their head coach at the time was Butch Jones. Everybody knows this guy, as he ended up quickly rising up the coaching ranks, made a name for himself at Central Michigan, and eventually took the head coaching job at Tennessee in 2013. His first 2 years were quite interesting in Knoxville, and 2015 was supposed to be a breakout season. That's exactly what would end up happening, as led by Josh Dobbs at quarterback, the Volunteers would end up going 9-4 with a 5-3 mark in the SEC Conference. Then they'd end up winning the Outback Bowl and finish the year ranked. It was a good year for Butch Jones, but things would fizzle out after he'd have a tremendous start to the 2016 season, but would fall off majorly, and then had a terrible 2017 season. Since then, he took a little bit of a coaching hiatus before spending 4 years at Arkansas State. Tennessee moved on to both Jeremy Pruitt and now, of course, Josh Heupel. Back in 2015, the Florida Gators were in an interesting position as they had just moved on from Will Muschamp. Jim McElwain was now going to be in his first season with the Florida Gators after coming over by way of Colorado State. That's where he had made a big name for himself for the last 3 years and was expected to turn the Florida program around. Luckily, he'd end up doing that. He actually would end up reaching the SEC championship in his first year, and they would ultimately go 10-4. They had that whole Will Grier saga, but that would be the peak of the McElwain era. He would go 9-4 in 2016 and once again reach the SEC championship, but after a 3-4 start in 2017, he ended up being fired. He ended up taking a little bit of time off, and since then has spent the last 6 years at Central Michigan. Florida, of course, moved forward with Dan Mullen and is now in the Billy Napier era. LSU was also in a very different spot back in 2015, as they had a very different style of offense and very different look. Known more for their running backs, Les Miles was at the helm for the LSU Tigers after originally blowing up at Oklahoma State. Les had been there for nearly 10 years, and so far become one of the best coaches in school history. 2015, though, would be the start of the end for him, as the Tigers would end up winning 9 games, but they would lose 3 straight games to finish the season against Bama, Arkansas, and Ole Miss. It was a tough way to finish the year, and Les would just not survive. A couple games into 2016, he was fired and replaced by Ed Orgeron, and then obviously LSU went on their tear in 2019, and then moved on from Orgeron, and is currently with Brian Kelly, who's somewhat on the hot seat. Les, on the other hand, ended up going to Kansas for 2 years before he was fired, had some allegations, and sort of fell off a cliff. While the first round of March Madness is over and there's been a lot of chalk, there is still a good opportunity to cash in on the games that are remaining. From the first tip-off to the Final Four, MyBookie has you covered in terms of high-stakes matchups, wild finishes, and big-time opportunities. They've packed in promotions, props, and features that make betting on this event not only exciting, but also profitable. For example, we still have 3 total games left in March Madness, including Florida versus Auburn in the Final Four, as well as Houston and Duke. And if you have a hunch that a certain team is going to win, like Cooper Flagg and Duke, you should just go ahead and make that pick. And if you're not a basketball fan anymore, there are plenty of other games to talk about, including the UFL, which will have a couple of games at the end of this week. When you decided what you're going to pick, go over to MyBookie and use my promo code Fisher50 for your first bet. Despite a calm start to the month of March, I think the madness will finally ensue in these later rounds, so be sure to take advantage of all the craziness. Again, be sure to use Fisher50 over at MyBookie. Thank you to them for sponsoring today's video. A lot of people forget that Kentucky football was a dustpan back in the day, especially in 2015. They couldn't get anything going for quite some time, but after Mark Stoops decided to come in after being the defensive coordinator at Florida State, he would slowly get things going down in Lexington. 2015 was supposed to be when he took the next step, but it unfortunately would not happen just yet. The Wildcats ended up going 5-7 that year with a 2-6 mark in the SEC Conference, but they were slowly starting to build something. But after the 2015 season, Stoops would find his rhythm, as the Wildcats would make 8 straight bowl games until the 2024 season. Stoops ended up having a bad season in 2024, but he's still one of the best coaches in school history, has made Kentucky football relevant, and should have a pretty decent leash there. Back in 2015, things were very different for the Missouri Tigers as well. The best coach in school history, Gary Pinkel, was there at the time, and 2015 would be his final season, after successfully leading them to some really good years in the Big 12, and then 2 SEC title appearances in 2013 and 14 that really helped put the Tigers back on the map. Unfortunately, 2015 would be a down year for the Tigers, and in Pinkel's final season, it was led by true freshman quarterback Drew Lock, and they were just not able to get anything going back in 2015, as they would miss a bowl game, and Gary Pinkel would end up getting sick and would retire. Mizzou would then move on to Barry Odom, who was just average, but then struck gold with Elijah Drinkwitz, who started out slow, but now has them surging in the modern college football era. Speaking of legendary coaches, South Carolina also had their best coach in school history in Steve Spurrier. We all know Spurrier's story by now, as he ended up winning the Heisman Trophy, was a huge coach at Florida, and even won a national championship in 1996. He ended up taking over for the Gamecock and would lead them to some of their most successful moments in school history. But 2015 would end up being a little bit of a disappointment for them, as he would just go 2-4 with an 0-4 mark in the SEC before he would decide to call it quits. They then moved forward with an interim head coach, and South Carolina's been in an interesting spot since then. They ended up whiffing on their next hire in Will Muschamp, but seemingly found the guy of the future in Shane Beamer, who, like Elijah Drinkwitz, has South Carolina currently surging. Spurrier, on the other hand, has retired and moved on to other things in life. The 2015 SEC West was absolutely brutal, and nobody got more of a difficult time than Brett Bielema. Bielema had been at Wisconsin for a couple of years before taking the head coaching job at Arkansas, and was seemingly starting to figure things out while he was in Fayetteville. 2015 would end up being a breakout season for them, as the Razorbacks would go 8-5 with a 5-3 mark in the conference, and they'd end up winning the Liberty Bowl. They honestly had some really fun players in that era, with guys like Hunter Henry, Brandon Allen, and even Jonathan Williams and Alex Collins. Unfortunately, Bielema would peak in 2015, as he'd only win 7 games in 16, and then 4 in 17, before he would then get fired. He took over as the head coach in Illinois in 2021, and is now leading the Illini to a lot of success. Arkansas then decided to move forward with Chad Morris, who was an absolute failure, before they would then hire Sam Pittman, who is currently still there, but on the hot seat. Speaking of other coaches who ended up flaming out, we get to talk about Kevin Sumlin. He was the head coach at Texas A&M, and one of the biggest names in college football coaching. He became a huge deal as the head coach at Houston, and was there for a couple of years before taking over at A&M in 2012. He ended up leading Johnny Manziel to his Heisman level season, and also had a brief stint with Kenny Hill. Despite a ton of quarterback talent, the 2015 season didn't go all that well at the quarterback position, and overall it was somewhat disappointing. Sure, the Aggies went 8-5, but they went 4-4 in the conference, lost their bowl game, and many expected them to be better. That was sort of the story with Kevin Sumlin, as he went 8-5 in 2016, then 7-5 in 2017, before he would end up getting fired. He'd then move on to Arizona, where things didn't work out there, and A&M decided to move forward with a huge hire in Jimbo Fisher, but that wasn't worth the money. Mike Elko seems to have A&M on the right path right now, but it's been quite a tumultuous decade for the Aggies, if we're being honest here. Sadly, even if we go back 10 years, Vanderbilt football was pretty much the same old, same old. They were considered the doormat of the SEC, and Derek Mason didn't exactly help that reputation. Sure, he had a lot of coaching experience, but after coming over as a defensive coordinator from Stanford, I don't really know what they expected. Mason tried to get the team moving in the right direction, but he really was never able to get things going, as he went 4-8 in 2015 with a 2-6 mark in the conference, and it was just another miserable season for the Commodores. Mason honestly really never saw much success, as he did win 6 games in both 2016 and 2018, but they lost both bowl games, never finished above 500, and Mason was fired after the 2020 season. They decided to move forward with former alum Clark Lee, and he has done a solid job so far, as they had a breakout season in 2024, but no one really knows what the future is for Vanderbilt, and Derek Mason took some time off before becoming the head coach at Middle Tennessee in 2024, and he won 3 games. Another coach who enjoyed a lot of success back in 2015 was Gus Malzahn. After blowing up in the coaching ranks, he'd eventually become the head coach at Arkansas State in 2012, before saving Auburn in just his second year. The Tigers had one of the most memorable seasons in school history in 2013, and it included a trip to the national championship. Guys like Nick Marshall and Trey Mason were a lot of fun to watch, and Malzahn was seen as the next big thing. Unfortunately, he was never really able to get quite back to his early success, as in 2015 the Tigers would go 7-6 with a 2-6 mark in the conference, but they did win the Birmingham Bowl. It was definitely a setback. That would be Malzahn's second worst season on the Plains though, as he then went 8 games, 10 games, 8 games, 9 games, and then only 6 games before moving on to UCF. He spent 4 years with the Knights, before then moving on, as he's now the offensive coordinator at Florida State. Auburn, on the other hand, ended up making a bad hire in Brian Harsin, and also got Hugh Freeze, who has not exactly lived up to the hype yet. Speaking of Hugh Freeze, he's the next guy we're to talk about on the list. He comes from a very similar background to Gus Malzahn, as Freeze ended up blowing up at Arkansas State as well, and actually was the Sun Belt Coach of the Year in 2011. He decided to take the Ole Miss job in 2012, and with guys like Bo Wallace and Laquan Treadwell, he had some really fun teams while he was there. 2015 was actually his best season at Ole Miss, as his team would end up going 10-3 with a 6-2 mark in the conference. They would end up winning the Sugar Bowl, but unfortunately it'd all go downhill from there, as Freeze was investigated, was doing some not so great stuff, and was forced to leave Ole Miss. He then took over as the head coach from Liberty to 2019 to 2022, before taking the Auburn job in 23, and so far he has a losing record there. The jury is still out on Freeze, but he'll have to pick things up soon. Ole Miss, on the other hand, ended up moving forward with Matt Luke, but that didn't work out, and now they have Lane Kiffin, who has them seeing a lot of success, but they haven't been able to get over the hump. I'm going to let you take a wild guess at who the coach for the Alabama Crimson Tide was. We all know who it was Nick Saban. There's not much that has to be talked about him, but Nick Saban was at the height of his Alabama dynasty, as back in 2015, he had the Tide in a wonderful position. They'd end up going 14-1, with a 7-1 record in the conference. They also made the college football playoff, won the national championship, finished ranked number 1, and did pretty much everything right. Saban continued his dynasty, as he ended up winning over 200 games at Alabama before he would retire after the 2023 season. Bama's now moved forward with Kalen DeBoer, who will be in his second season, and many are hoping for him to have a better showing this year. While the Georgia Bulldogs were considered the premier team in the SEC East back then, they weren't as dominant as they are now. At the time, they had head coach Mark Richt, who had been the longtime head man in Athens. 2015 was unfortunately a bad season for him though, as he really butchered the quarterback spot, and ultimately the team would end up going 9-3 with a 5-3 record in the conference. The team ended up losing on the road to Tennessee in October, and then 2 blowouts against Bama and Florida would end up being the nail in the coffin for Richt, as after the season was over, he would leave for Miami. He'd end up winning 26 games there, with a near college football playoff run in 2017, but Georgia ended up making the better hire. As some say, they were trying to prevent Kirby Smart from going to South Carolina, so they went out and got him, the former alum. Smart has become the best coach in school history for Georgia, has them at the top of college football, and they're in a great spot, and upgraded from Richt. Last but not least, we get to talk about the Mississippi State Bulldogs. Mississippi State has not been known to be at the top of the SEC either, but back in 2015, they were coming off their best season in quite some time, as head coach Dan Mullen had them firing on all cylinders. Guys like Dak Prescott, Chris Jones, and Josh Robinson were a lot of fun to watch for the Bulldogs, and of course, they had that incredible 2014 season. Unfortunately, 2015 would be a little bit of a fall off for them as they go from 10-3 to 9-4, but this was still incredible for them as they ended up winning the Belk Bowl. From there, Mullen would fall off a bit as he only won 6 games in 2016 and then 8 games in 2017 before he would take the head coaching job at Florida. Despite winning 34 games down in Gainesville, he was fired after the 2021 season, took some time off, and is now the head coach at UNLV and will be in his first season replacing Barry Odom. Mississippi State has had a very difficult time since then, as Joe Moorhead became the head coach, but didn't last very long. Then they ended up getting Mike Leach, who tragically passed away, had 1 season of Zach Arnett, and now are in year 2 of Jeff Lebby. Honestly, it seems the Bulldogs are probably in the worst spot of any SEC team right now, as I would pick them to do better than Vanderbilt this year. But still, it's been a tough couple of years for them, and it's notoriously very hard to win there. But yeah, this is what was going on a decade ago in college football. Now I want to hear your thoughts. Which coaches are you surprised were there in 2015? What do you think of the current state of your SEC team? And also, what kind of spotlight from 10 years ago in college football do you want me to do next? Be sure to let me know down below, leave a like if you can support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.